So, if you've ever played games like Forza, there's a lot of car brands and companies you probably don't recognize. However, one that seems to catch a lot of people's eyes is the brand that goes by the name Holden. And this is usually due to the fact that people see the cars and they look eerily familiar to cars offered in their home countries. And this is probably true, as Holden is a now defunct brand that was formerly owned by GM, and up until recently made some absolutely amazing performance cars that we did get a taste of here in the States. But that's not the full story, so I kind of want to introduce people who may not know about this honestly amazing brand and give you a quick rundown on why it failed and the amazing cars that the Aussies and us Americans had to unfortunately say goodbye to. So just quickly, I'm not going to go over the full history. I'm just going to touch on some key points and more focus on the recent downfall of Holden and the shameful shell of a brand that GM has in Australia right now. So Holden actually traces its roots back to the 1850s that is, as they originally made horse saddles, but made the switch to auto manufacturing in 1908. However, they realized pretty quickly that the business of making cars can cost a very pretty penny. Pair that with some sort of emo phase that the world economy was going through in the 30s, and Holden called their Yankee buddies over at GM and asked if they would be interested in purchasing them, which GM obviously said yes to. And during their pairing, they made some absolutely kick-ass cars that especially us Americans can appreciate, as they were essentially muscle cars that we never got to get our hands on, like the Monaro, the Torana, and even a panel van called the Sandman. These cars look amazing and perform the part as well, as these also helped popularize not only the Holden badge in Australia, but the V8 supercar series as well. Anyways, skipping ahead a bit to the late 80s, Holden and this guy partner up to create Holden Special Vehicles, or more commonly known as HSV. Think of HSV as Holden's AMG or M, except it is a little more weird, because you see, at the time, HSV acted more like Brabus or Saleen does, in the sense that they had ties to the brand, but weren't really sold at dealerships. It's just a little weird. All that you need to know is that the guys and gals at HSV knew how to turn a wrench and then some, turning this, a standard Holden Commodore, into this, a Holden Commodore SS-SV, which used a 5-liter V8 that was good for 241 horsepower and turning a hell of a lot of fuel into a hell of a lot of noise. And yes, I understand that horsepower figure doesn't sound like a lot today, because it isn't, but you have to keep in mind this was during the 80s, a time when Fox body Mustangs were making 225 horsepower, and then here comes this commuter car out of nowhere, and it has the ability to just absolutely smoke imports and anything else that they're challenging. It would be the equivalent of if Hyundai turned the Elantra into a Hellcat competitor. Anyways, continuing on in the early 2000s, Slipknot was taking the world by storm. Also, Holden was putting up record numbers in terms of sales, and at its peak, it sold over 88,000 cars, which would have been a decent number here stateside, but we have to keep in mind that Australia is a much smaller market, and 88,000 cars sold in a year is monumental. They made awesome cars like the updated Monaro, which we did get here in the States in the form of the Pontiac GTO, and Europe got as well as the Vauxhall Monaro, and they also continued to make the Commodore, which we also got here in the States in the form of the Pontiac G8. And quick sidetrack, we were even going to get the Ute version that they had in Australia. However, the 08 financial crisis kind of blasted the kneecaps off that idea pretty quickly. Anyways, as time went on, unfortunately, the issues started mounting up for Holden, and they did so very quickly. First off, the higher-ups at Holden and GM were not fans of each other, as Holden wanted to operate more as an independent brand, which to be fair, they totally earned the right to do. However, this was not a part of GM's plan at the time, and it's not what they wanted Holden to do. They wanted Holden to fall in line and do as they were told. Economic issues like exchange rates plagued production as well, causing costs on building cars to skyrocket. And finally, in 2007, Holden was beginning to fall in line with GM. Now, for any of my super smart viewers out there, do we remember what happens in the year after 2007? That's right, 2008, and a massive real estate crisis in the US that kickstart a global recession. And for all my history buffs out there, do we remember what happened to GM during said recession? That's right, they fared about as well as the Titanic did. Needless to say, the timing for Holden literally could not have been any worse if they tried. Obviously, we know now that you and I bailed out GM, but that kind of left Holden in limbo, as the US government ordered GM to kill off brands to save costs. But they fortunately spared Holden and instead killed off Hummer, Pontiac, Saturn, and Saab. And to be fair to GM, Holden was extremely lucky, as they hadn't turned a profit since 2004, so the fact that they were still a brand is a miracle. However, things did start to look up, as Holden started working out deals with the Australian government. Thanks to those government deals, they were able to start manufacturing rebadged GM cars like the Cruise. However, things quickly started spiraling downwards again, as sales slowly started dropping year after year, and little to no changes in their lineup in terms of new cars or major refreshers to the old names. And the buying public just seemed to get bored of Holden. As jobs were slowly and quietly cut, it didn't look good when in 2012, the brand was given essentially a Hail Mary pass from the government in the form of a $250 million loan. And to be fair, it's not like nobody cared about the brand. Obviously, the government just gave them a loan, and the workers union actually voted to freeze their wage increases for 3 years to try and ensure that the only plant still open, the Elizabeth plant, would continue to stay open. But it just wasn't enough. And by 2013, that government Hail Mary loan had been burnt through, and and then some. And unfortunately, GM announced that Holden would cease all domestic engine and vehicle manufacturing, essentially making the Holden brand nothing more than a shill for rebadged GM products like the Camaro. And I know you probably think it can't get any worse, but believe me, it does. Because in 2020, even before COVID was a thought in people's heads, GM announced that by the end of the following year, Holden as a brand was done. Now, during all this time, these bad things didn't stop Holden and HSV from making some amazing cars. The Commodore was still being produced through all this. And before I go any further, yes, we did get this in the form of the Chevy SS, and yes, I would sell all of my personal possessions and send all of my future children to the mines for no pay if it meant I could get one. Anyways, over there, they were called Commodores, just like I said. See, we only got the four-door sedans with the LS3s, but not only did they get the sedans with the LS3s, but they got wagons with LS3s. Do you Aussies understand what I would do to have something like that here? They also got Utes with LS3s, but that isn't all. No, it gets much better. Remember those grease goblins over at HSV that I mentioned before? Well, they got their oil-soaked gears and their noggins churning, and they concocted the Commodore HSV GTS, which used the supercharged LSA to make around 570 horsepower, a factory supercharged four-door sedan. You lucky bastards. But wait, it gets better, as there are 4 GTSR W1 Maloos, which are Utes, that use the LS9, basically the same one out of the C6 ZR1. That's good for around 630 horsepower. These guys were making TRXs before the TRX was even a thought in our heads. Now, the story behind these trucks is actually kind of cool, as they were never even meant to be made. But Holden just had a few trucks lying around and a few LS9s lying around, and it was the closing days, so their attitude towards it was like, what's GM gonna do? Yell at us? And now, these 4 essentially ZR1 Utes are estimated to be worth more than $1 million for a pickup. I bet you never thought that was gonna happen, huh? There are a million more cool Holdens that have been made, but I don't want to bore you by going over every single one. Back to the brand itself, after it shuttered its doors in 2021, GM decided that they still wanted a brand in Australia, and they put a brand in called GMSV, or GM Special Vehicles. And if you go to their website right now, the only things that they sell is the Silverado and the Corvette. Now, I don't know how bad Aussies want those vehicles because I don't live there, but even still, that's a pathetic lineup. I don't even live there, and I feel insulted thanks to GM's refusal to help the brand after forcing it to become more interconnected with GM International, and then dragging them under post-financial crisis and making essentially every single wrong decision that they could. Now, it isn't entirely GM's fault. As with most great things in life, politics played a heavy role as well, which I don't want to get into because nothing good ever comes from politics. My point is that this is not enough. At the very least, bring over cars even if the Aussies don't buy them. Just pretend to show that you care even a little bit.